Hello and welcome to the Paddock Pass podcast. On today's show, we're going to have a very special guest. We've got Kevin Schwantz on the show, so former 500 Grand Prix world champion, and Adam Wheeler. It was great to get the time with Kevin. And you were a very busy man last weekend at COTA. Lots of interviews. Now you're back in Barcelona. You're able to hopefully relax for a wee while, Adam. But that was a busy weekend for you.
Coupled with the fact that it was also another round of MXGP, which kind of finished, Steve, right between sort of Moto 2 and Moto 3, so it made things extra hectic. But yeah, looking forward to a weekend off and then to Jerez, which should be slightly easy for all of us in terms of the timetable.
It's a bit of a strange one right now because David Emmett, I'm in the Netherlands. I'm ready for Dutch World SBK this weekend at Assen, and the weather is awful. I landed and it's been raining nonstop. It's scheduled to be about 6 degrees this week. So I can understand why you decided to get out of Holland for this week.
Yeah, well, I'm heading home tonight, so I shall be in the same country as you tomorrow. And looking forward to it being sort of cold and miserable. But, it's in the UK, it's been cold and miserable too. It's been cold and windy and blustery. I think we had 2 decent days. But, yeah, looking forward to getting down to Jerez and seeing actually having some decent weather.
Yeah, Renthal always around to look forward to. But Neil, Dave's mentioned miserable. You're obviously had the weekend off in COTA. That must have left you fairly miserable, just not to be over there for a race like that.
Exactly. Miserable and slightly concerned because, as we were saying in our WhatsApp group, really quite worried the fact that one of Ad's preseason predictions has turned out to be actually completely bang on the money. I mean, it's just, remarkable.
It's terrifying.
Why are you surprised? Why are you surprised? I have previous.
You do. Yeah, you do have previous as one of the signs of the apocalypse. So this is your predictions are even more worrying than my predictions.
Nothing is as worrying as your predictions, Dave. But I think we might as well kick it off with the Maverick Viñales topic because that's the big talk point after COTA. This was the second week in a row, Neil, where we saw Maverick do something really special. And to be able to back up Portimao was important with another sprint performance. And then, most importantly, the race result here in COTA. Like, this has been a really strong start to the season for Maverick. But what do you see that makes you become an Adam Wheeler believer?
That is a good question, Steve. Yeah, I mean, is this a flash in the pan for Maverick, or is this Maverick here as a bona fide championship challenger? I mean, it's a very good question to ask. I'm going to horribly sit on the fence here and just say that I think we're far too early into the season to really have a definitive opinion. But I mean, to give some historical context, I mean, we're talking about a guy that last had back-to-back podiums in the middle of 2022. Before that, it was the start of 2020, and he's a rider that's never scored more than 3 back-to-back podiums consecutively, which shows that he's never been a super consistent runner since he joined MotoGP in 2017. In that time, there were definitely years when he was on one of the best bikes, if not the best bike. So I'm inclined to say no, he's not going to be a championship contender, and it's a flash in the pan, so to speak. But then there is part of me that thinks that this is kind of the most impressive and convincing that Mavericks looked since probably 2017 when he first stepped up into MotoGP. The Aprilia is clearly a fantastic motorcycle this year. It took Maverick a little longer than I anticipated to get the hang of it. And he is showing a kind of mental resilience within races that we hadn't seen for years and years. So it looks really promising, I think, for both him and Aprilia. But calling him a championship challenger, calling him a guy that's going to push the Bagnaiyas and the Marquezes and the Martins of this world, I think I'll stop just short of saying that.
I think I'm going to lean a little bit more towards, I think he can do it. I have to back up my verdict, of course. But, I mean, this is one of our 3 big discussion points on this particular podcast. But I think everything just seems to fall in Maverick's favour. I mean, he turned 29 in January. I mean, it's his 10th year in MotoGP, 14th year in World Championship level. Okay, some of the stats, like you pointed out, Neil, don't swing so much in his favor, such as, he's only finished third in the World Championship twice, in the Premier class. And there's not a great deal of statistics that would say this guy is going to be going on a hot streak to rack up the trophies. But I think, like we heard from Manuel Cazou, his crew chief, over the weekend at COTA, they spent a year basically trying to get the right setup, the optimum feeling on the RSGP last year. And I think it's all building to a point where the bike, where we thought pre-season in the early part of the season was more towards Aleix, is actually probably more in Maverick's direction. And he's in a prime position now where if he drops the ball again, then it really falls on him. Whereas in the past, I think for the last year and a half, has been very much trying to get the Aprilia married to his style and to his abilities. And, I think COTA was the clearest sign that he's going to be, more of a threat than he has been in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to admit this, but I'm leaning towards Adam on this. He really does. I mean, there was a whole bunch of things. First of all, Adam makes a really good point that the bike is better. The other thing is that Maverick seems more settled and more stable. It was very interesting that after both podiums this week, he said he mentioned his family, and he really, really reinforced that idea of the stability that he has with his family is what is really helping him perform. The other thing is, I went back and actually looked at what he said after Qatar, because I remember at the Sepang test, he was unhappy. He couldn't get comfortable with the bike. It couldn't do things. There were things that it wasn't doing right. At Qatar, after Qatar, he said, look, because he only finished, I think, something like ninth, around ninth or something. And there you go, ninth and 10th. And he sort of said, well, look, the result doesn't really reflect where we are. I feel this is really positive. We've really built. We've sort of got a lot. We got a lot out of this race. He goes to Portimao. He wins the sprint. He crashes out of second place, and then he comes to COTA and just completely destroys COTA. He just destroys everyone at COTA. That, I think, there's a real sense that he's building up. He's comfortable with the bike. The bike, it's a good point out. The bike is it's a little bit closer to his style, where he likes to carry a lot of corner speed, but he doesn't do it the same way that Aleix does. Aleix really sort of charges into a corner, carrying a lot of corner on entry. Whereas Maverick is more sort of mid corner and then getting the drive out of it. And he just looked really, really good. Now, the problem with Maverick is when things go wrong, you have to see how he deals with it. That, to me, we have to wait for the next bad weekend, really. Whether that'll be at Jerez, I don't know. But at some point, he'll just have a bad weekend where nothing works. And how he deals with that and bounces back from that, I think, will be the decisive factor. But genuinely, he's in a really, really impressive form right now.
Just to follow on from what you were saying, Dave, two things that I have to say. But to follow on, firstly, from that point you just made, there have been plenty of occasions in the last 12 months when things have gone badly wrong for Maverick. And to be fair to him, he does keep coming back. He doesn't go off and throw a tantrum and fall out with his team and things become irreparable with Aprilia. That happened in his Yamaha days, but we haven't seen that much from him in the last 2 years. So I think, that bodes well. He is a guy that is well accustomed to going through crazy lows as well as the occasional high. And also just, Adam, you touched on his crew chief, Jose Manuel Cazou. Maverick has had a bit of a turbulent time with a couple of his crew chiefs in the past, notably Ramon Forcada when he was at Yamaha. Then there was that crazy year in 2021, just before he left Yamaha, where they were swapping and changing his crew chiefs. Nothing was really kind of sticking, nothing was going right. I think in Cazou, he has someone who knows him, knows his kind of weaknesses, knows how to manage him personally. And I don't think that's always been the case. And I remember speaking to Jose Manuel after Maverick left Suzuki at the end of 2016. And he said, if Maverick stayed with us, in fact, sorry, it was the end of 2017. Kazoo said, if Maverick stayed with Suzuki in 17 rather than go to Yamaha, and he had a core of people that knew how to kind of work around him, I've no question that he would have maybe fought or won the championship in that particular year. So I think now that Kazoo is up to speed and Aprilia knows the bike well, has the setting kind of in place for Maverick, I think that is another factor that's going to be really, really important for this year, because he's a quality crew chief, quality technician, very highly thought of in the paddock. And things kind of fell in line because he was working with Alex Rins at Suzuki before Suzuki withdrew. And that is kind of how he ended up at Aprilia. So, I think Maverick is really lucky to have him back in his corner, and that, I think, helps his prospects this year.
I think Dave's point about bouncing back from adversity is really strong, because I think it's something that Maverick tries to work on. I mean, we've all been in debriefs where things have been going fantastically for him on Friday, then they disintegrate on Saturday, but he's still telling us that things are good. That he'll turn it around, it's not as bad as it looks and stuff like that. So the signals are there. But, another factor I think as well is just the fragility of the RSGP. I mean, we saw an issue that badly affected his race in Portugal, like Dave pointed out. And if the bike does have those hiccups, which it's been prone to do in the last couple of years, then that's also going to be an obstacle to stop Maverick going for that world title. He picked up 5 DNFs last year. I think from the last 5 rounds, he only finished in the top 10 once. And against sort of the Ducatis, those blips of form is something that you can't really concede. So it's, I think it's all in his hands, though.
I think for me, one of the things that's quite interesting with Aprilia is the fact that Maverick is, talent-wise, always been one of those riders everyone keeps an eye on. We know how good he can be, Neil. But when you look at him compared to Aleix, it always looks to me like Aleix was a great guy to bring Aprilia to a certain point, but they need someone that can make that final step. Maverick has shown himself to be a better rider than Aleix over the course of his career, whether you look at 125s, Moto3, Moto2. And now that they've made that step with the bike, maybe it's a Maverick that can make that little bit of an extra step. Maybe Aleix can get you 90% of the way there, and Maverick gets you an extra 5 or 6%.
Yeah, maybe it is a Maverick, something of a Maverick that can get you over that last 6%, Steve, you could say. But yeah, I mean, it's still not an absolute given. I think, it's fair to say Maverick is definitely more talented than Aleix. Aleix has done a superb job at Aprilia getting them as far as they are currently. I don't think Aleix is ever going to win a world championship. I'm still on the fence. I still don't think Maverick is going to fight for the championship this year. I just think we've seen too much in the past to suggest that he can't put a full championship together. But with everything working in his favor, maybe we'll see him start to lead the Aprilia charge, which I think would be a big achievement, especially given Aleix's potential over the preseason. And it does put Aprilia in a genuine dilemma if Maverick keeps this up, really. I mean, probably a good problem to have, but if Aleix does decide to stay on, then they've got a pretty difficult decision to make. Do they stick or do they twist? Because there's definitely going to be one of 2 very, very, very competitive Ducati riders that will be looking to probably leave. I'm thinking of either Martin or Bastianini. And it's going to be, I mean, you would be kind of crazy if someone like Martin came on the market to not go for him. And I think you could probably say the same about Bastianini. So yeah, that's an interesting decision that Aprilia bosses have to make in the next couple of months.
I think it's one of those ones as well where when Fabio decided not to go to Aprilia, we were able to see how much money was put on the table from Yamaha. And Aprilia, we all thought, would have that sort of resources with the Piaggio group, and they didn't want to put it into hiring someone like Fabio. So maybe for Martin, it's a bit different because his contract, obviously he wants to be on the factory Ducati bike and in the Lenovo colours, but maybe for him it's a little bit different. If he's offered the same sort of rate that Fabio was offered, maybe it becomes a lot more appealing. But that's going to be one of the big things for the next 4, 5, 6 rounds to see what's going to happen there.
Yeah, I think if Martin is offered $4 million, he'd take it because that is way more that he's getting at the moment. I think also it'll be much easier. Let's say Maverick does stay on. It's going to be much easier for Aprilia to persuade Aleix to retire if they hire Martin than it is if they hire Bastianini. But Martin and Aleix both have a good very good relationship. They're going to be able to get on well, and I think it makes the retirement question that little bit easier. But the question of what is a better rider is really, really complex because it's so many different things. I mean, like Aleix is much more consistent than Maverick, but Maverick is much more talented. But so far, Aleix has generally tended to outperform Maverick over the course of the season. So it's horses for courses.
And also, if the management sort of
go on, Heather.
Also, like if the management, decree that there's not that much difference in results potential between Viñales and Aleix, then maybe it comes down to bike development. And they might think, well, Aleix has been with us this far and he's got the bike this far. He's maybe deserving of the contract renewal. Maybe Maverick pushes for 2 years. Aleix is happier for 1 year. Maybe Aprilia also want an Italian rider, which, as Neil says, kind of points them towards Bastianini. But also don't forget people like Joan Mir. I mean, there's a rider there with experience of 2 other manufacturers, or one of them was good at least. So, but there's perhaps some expertise there that, Aprilia want to tap into. They have options, and you would assume that that's probably going to be the brand that swap around the rider roster more when the likes of Joe Roberts are also involved on the Trackhouse side.
Yeah, I think when you've got that competitive package, you hold a lot of the cards. In the past, Aprilia didn't have that. And they do have a good package underneath them. And the Trackhouse situation is going to be interesting to keep an eye on as well, to see whether or not in the next few months Miguel Oliveira makes the step forward that he needs to make on that bike as well. And then people like Mir, former world champion, it's been an incredibly tough time for him. But he still has that championship and a win to be able to bring to the table. But it'd be interesting to see what happens for Aprilia going forward. Just on the podcast, I think it's over the last few months, we've heard all of us talk an awful lot about Fly Racing and the products that they have. This is the 25th anniversary of Fly Racing, and they're one of the biggest brands in off-road gear, but they've also got a lot of really cool street gear as well. The Formula S helmet has some of the most advanced safety tech on the market. David, you've worn a lot of their gear in the past as well, and always gave it good reviews. So check out flyracing.com to be able to have a look at some of what they're able to offer as well. Adam, we're going to move it on to the next part of the show, and it's a big part of the show. We've got Kevin Schwantz on the call with us as well, and yourself and Neil had 20 minutes with Kevin just to be able to get him up to speed on MotoGP right now, and it was a really interesting chat.
Yeah, absolutely, Steve. Full props to Neil for chasing Kevin, because we tried to get him on the show before the Grand Prix, but obviously he's been a busy man. We talked a bit about Laguna Seca as well, and he sort of pointed out that was more a home Grand Prix for the likes of sort of Wayne Rainey, Eddie Lawson, whereas, COTA and stuff is in his backyard, being from Texas. One thing I should point out is that for people listening to the podcast, maybe you should go and have a look at the YouTube video that will be online as well, because the background, which Neil references towards the end of the interview, was quite stunning. And also Kevin sort of whips his laptop around at some point to show us the rest of the room, which leads on to 1 or 2 more questions. And it was fairly spectacular, I have to say. It was like doing a podcast with someone in their own personal museum.
Yeah, it was super cool to have Kevin on the show and to listen to his insights about last weekend. And Kevin was partly responsible for me becoming a massive MotoGP fan when I was a little nipper, maybe 3 or 4, watching old grainy VHS tapes of Kevin. For any of our listeners that are under the age of 30, there was this thing called the VHS player where you would have to wait basically about 2 weeks after the race to actually see what happened in it, because it wasn't broadcast live on TV. You'd have to go to like some rental shop and purchase or rent one of these kind of race reviews, and then get like 40 or 50 minutes on kind of like grainy footage. But yeah, sort of watching that I first sort of saw Kevin's riding, which obviously was just cavalier and spectacular and fun. And he was sort of, you think of guys like Rossi, you think of guys like Marquez. There's certain races which kind of defy, or certain performances from them which defy logic, and definitely Schwantz had a bit of that in his armory. There were a couple of his wins which were just legendary, where he had no right to be there, no right to be fighting at the front, and did things to win those races where everyone just thought, wow, that was truly something audacious and special. Thinking of like Suzuka 91 or Hockenheim 91, when he pulled possibly one of the most famous overtaking moves of all time, or Wayne Rainey. Donington 94, where he was riding basically with one arm after a massive qualifying crash. So, those reasons were some of why he was so adored. Like, he was definitely the most popular rider of his day, and very interesting guy to talk to.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those ones as well, Neil, that it's worth remembering that sometimes you had to rent the video machine as well just to watch the video of the race. But for Schwantz, he was a rider that when he came onto the scene, he really burst onto the scene. Obviously, he had partial seasons before his first full year in '88, but winning at Suzuka really set the tone because he was just a spectacular rider that was able to really capture attention. And Dave, it's one of those ones where the riders that get popular like that are typically the ones that are the nearly men. And Kevin was that nearly man for so much of his career until he was finally able to win the '93 championship. And then after Wayne Rainey retired, Kevin's talked about it, where the desire just wasn't quite there. And having that rivalry is what made 500 Grand Prix, or has always been key for MotoGP to have that success.
Yeah, I mean, his rivalry with Rainey does not require any further explanation. Really, it was one of the fiercest rivalries and one of the bitterest rivalries as well, I think, in history. I think also, like, Schwantz was also, he was a bit of an underdog. He was the nearly man. He kept on being beaten, and I think that was what made him loved, apart from his he was spectacular to see. He loved, he was the see God, wait till you see God and then brakes, or kind of a rider. He had the bike on his nose a lot. I think one of my funniest memories of Schwantz was watching him crash in the gravel and then grab the oil flag off of, I think it was at Hockenheim.
Donington, 92.
Was it Donington? There you go. Yeah, that's right. Crashing in the gravel, grabbing the oil flag and then waving it around and pushing people away because there was on the track. But that also, I think, was Kevin Schwantz.
Yeah, I remember actually at Indy in 2015 as well, there was a note left on my laptop by Jensen Beeler. And JB left, "Jesus loves you, Steve. I think you're a dickhead." And Schwantz was walking down the media centre and spotted this. And he said, "Is it true?" And I said, "Jesus does love me, but yes, I am a dickhead."
And that was when you arrived back. When you were away, he kept on coming over and laughing and like pointing to your screen and like kind of like looking at us, like fully having a bit of a laughing attack, which was great. That was the first time I think I ever actually came across him in person.
It was like a scene of contradictions, really, wasn't it? Because as fantastic as Schwantz was on the bike, he was also frustrating for the mistakes that he would make and not really challenge Rainey more, viciously, I guess, for the championship. And, you just saw these contradictions all the time. I mean, I remember his crash Phillip Island where he sort of looked over his shoulder and it just seemed to be another mistake. There were a couple of races, I think, in that 88 or 89 season where he was leading comfortably. Jerez maybe was one of them. Just really sort of errors where you're left shaking your head. You're sort of admiring the genius of the man, but then you're left shaking the head at the sort of the stupidity, almost, for want of a better word. I don't mean to be rude, but I'm trying to work out whether that was ultimately frustrating about him as a rider or it was one of the fantastically entertaining factors. But he was, I think he was always a little bit more sort of the media friendly of that sort of pack in the golden era. And it was good to sort of speak with him again.
Yeah, I think he always said that when he started out in 500s, he didn't just want to win. He wanted to lap everyone. He wanted to rub everyone's face in it as much as possible. And he needed someone with more experience than him in his garage to just say, look, you're a second faster per lap than everyone. Just take a deep breath. You don't need to do this kind of stuff. And it wasn't until he had Stuart Shenton, his crew chief that came in at the start of 92, that he had that sort of experienced figure that could say that to him. And then obviously, what followed with Stuart's arrival was the championship in '93. So plenty to discuss.
Yeah, well, let's roll the audio now and hear from Kevin. And great to have him on the Paddock Pass podcast.
So we're here with Kevin Schwantz. Delighted to have you on the show, Kevin. Thanks so much for joining us on the Paddock Pass podcast. First of all, I guess I have to ask: have you caught your breath back after Sunday? Because that was quite a race that we witnessed.
It really was. The only problem we had on Monday was we had a lot of people flying out of the airport, and I had to make 2 or 3 runs to the airport. So Monday was kind of hectic too, but it's life back to normal now. And an unbelievable race. And actually I didn't get to see much of Moto3, but between Moto2 and MotoGP, both outstanding races.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we get into the details of the weekend, Kevin, I guess a lot of our listeners are probably interested to know what you're up to these days. We see you come to Austin, I think, pretty much every year. But, between races, what are you up to? And are you still keeping a kind of a close eye on everything that's happening in the MotoGP?
I try and watch every MotoGP race live. Sometimes the scheduling's a little bit off, so I'll have to watch it recorded, the next day or something. But, I try and keep tabs a little bit on what's going on. I'm definitely not the insider that the guys that go every weekend and get to hear all the stories of what's going on and how tires fade and how you can't be in the draft. And there's so many things about the bike now that they're so finicky. You really gotta pay attention, and having a dash where they can talk to you and give you messages on what to do. I think I'm not sure it would have been more confusing than good for me. It's like I'm out here racing. I don't need any signs, any signals. Just let's go to the end and we'll be done. But
Kevin, I'm fighting a bit of jet lag. I've just arrived back from Austin. I saw you from a distance at the Circuit of the Americas. Is it me, or did it seem like there was more buzz at this GP? There was a lot of people in the paddock. There seemed like there was more fans in the spectator zones. There was a nice vibe to it.
Yeah, I heard from some of the guys in the vendor areas that work at Suzuki said that the people in there on Friday were as big as they were on Saturday last year. So I can only assume that attendance numbers were up. I know the grid on Saturday for the sprint race and the grid on Sunday, there was more people than I've ever seen on the grid. And I don't know, they're just handing out more passes now and not being as limited in how many passes you can have. But definitely seemed to be a bigger buzz. And I watched it at the race again last night on TV. And to see the people all coming in on the track on Sunday after the race, they filled up that front straightaway pretty quick.
Yeah, they did. I mean, about the race, Kevin, you've obviously were responsible for a few epic, famous comebacks in your day as a racer. We saw a similar one from Maverick on Sunday, coming all the way from 11th to win. It was a fantastic race up until he got to the front, and then he kind of managed to break clear. But how did you see that performance from Maverick? How did you see the race in general?
Oh, I mean, it was all weekend. First practice, he was the fastest guy, and I don't know what they figured out, or if Maverick got everything between his ears right this weekend, and he was just on fire. I've started on the third row and won a Grand Prix, but I've never started on the front and gone back past the third row and come back to the front. So, and just as calm and collected as he could be the whole time, making passes on the brakes, get a good run off the corner and just slot yourself right up inside somebody. Never looked to be taking any risks that that seemed to be extreme for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the most dramatic moments, I think, was when we saw Marc crash out. We later learned that he was having a bit of an issue with his front brake, and that was one of the reasons I think we saw some of the more on the limit moves that he was making before his crash. I mean, have you ever had an experience like that? Can you explain to listeners what that kind of feels like when you go to pull the front brake and it's not actually there?
It gets you off in the corner deeper than you want to be. And, the one experience that I remember very well was 88 at the British Grand Prix. And I decided I was going to move up the inside with cold carbon brakes. And it let me go past about 3 guys before it ever even started slowing down. So I'm sneaking up on the corner now going, oh, this is not going to be good. And unfortunately for me and for Ron Haslam, Ron was the guy that took the brunt of it. He got back up and finished the race. But I really, being as though we were at the British Grand Prix, kind of wished I could have dug myself a hole, just out of that gravel trap and maybe out of the track and gotten away without having to confront any British fans.
I was at that race, Kevin. You were public enemy number 1 because we had big hopes of Ron at that race. It wasn't doing. The bike was half competitive on the Honda that year, so it was. Couldn't have been that easy for
even worse. Even worse, it was a first lap move, so that was even dumber from my standpoint. For Marc to have had the issue, maybe was having issues. Maybe I'd be a little more conservative on the brakes. The other thing that I noticed was whatever lap it was when he and Martin came together, knocked a wing off the front of it. I mean, little bit less downforce one side or the. I mean, I have no idea how aerodynamics on a motorcycle work because I've never ridden one with big wings on it. But that could have played a factor in it too, I think.
Kevin, we spoke to Wayne Rainey. He's coming on the show next week, and I was asking him about sort of a home Grand Prix event for you guys at the time, when sort of 500cc racing was at its peak. And, how was it for you? Because, I mean, Wayne was describing at Laguna Seca, you would have to buy like 100 passes, and he had to sort everyone out and pretty much say, okay, guys, have a good Grand Prix. I'll see you on Sunday night, because the scrutiny was pretty intense. I mean, what were sort of your memories of home GP fuss at that time?
Well, and him much more so than me. He was fortunate enough to call it it was his home track. His house was right across the street. I think a little bit more local knowledge of the track than I had. So it was always a fight for me, even trying to keep up with him. So besides the 40 or 50 or 60 friends that I had coming, and yeah, everybody went, let's go to dinner Friday night. Let's go to dinner. I was like, you guys, I've got to be on my game on Sunday, even more so here than most places, just because Wayne was so fast there.
Kevin, it seems like the next few years are going to be an interesting time to be an American MotoGP fan. What with the Liberty acquisition, which looks like it might go through by the end of this year. It seems from their comments that they're really keen to try and penetrate the American market. I mean, for them to have success in that field, do you have any ideas or any thoughts on how they can do that? Because I know MotoGP maybe isn't at the forefront of the kind of the consciousness in America, but obviously, if you look at Sunday's race, there's a great product to sell there.
Yeah, I think the racing, the competition in MotoGP compared to what happens in F1 right now, it's kind of a bad time for F1 because there is a dominant, very, very dominant team there and a very dominant driver in that dominant team. I think MotoGP with just a little bit of work could really become something here in America. The problem we have in America is we have so many stick and ball sports that take up most of our live television on the weekends, whether you got to watch basketball, football, baseball, soccer, tennis, whatever it might be. Motorsports, I think, especially MotoGP, the excitement that there is there, I think there's a huge spot for it. It just needs I back up to Liberty Media and them doing Drive to Survive. I've got people that call me when F1's coming to Austin, like, can you get us tickets? We really love that sport. I was like, you were barely even a fan of motorsports when I raced. How does this happen? And everybody says the same thing. That Drive to Survive gives you the insight on the drivers and a little bit of insight on the team, what goes on race weekends. And I think they can do something very similar like that with MotoGP. And I bet it would be super beneficial.
Just coming back to the race a little bit, Kevin, people associate you with Suzuki, that's sort of a little bit your legacy, and there's a feeling of being an icon in that respect. So is it kind of weird to imagine Japanese manufacturers struggling to score points now in MotoGP?
Every time we watch qualifying and it comes down to the last laps of Q2 and you look and there's 6 Japanese bikes at the very back, is unbelievable. To have Yamaha and Honda both stuck back there, to me is something I didn't think I would ever see in my lifetime. I think that the Japanese are so set in the ways they've always done things, and until a Ducati or an Aprilia or a KTM's come along, it's been sufficient. They fight each other. It's funny because they're kind of fighting each other to try and score that last point or 2 or 3. Quartararo, I think, was 12th this weekend, which it's probably more points than any of the teams have scored all season long. So tough, and I don't know the answer. Lots of hard work. Honda having 4 guys out there, Yamaha just having 2. I can see the turn for either one of them coming quicker for the Honda guys. I don't know. The Honda guys can't be seen to be finishing races, so they're not getting much data and much information from the actual race itself. But it can be a long, hard job ahead of them, and they're working nonstop, I'm sure, in Japan, both at Yamaha and at Honda, to try and get things figured out.
Were you ever frustrated by the Japanese machine, so to speak, Kevin, in terms of bringing new stuff and developing and whatever else?
When I raced, being at Suzuki, it's a much smaller factory than Yamaha or Honda, either one. So we'd come up with something that we thought we needed, a frame maybe a little bit stiffer or something along those lines. it would take 2 months to get one. Whereas you'd hear of some of the mechanics who came to work for us from Honda and Yamaha, both saying, we put in a request for a chassis that does this, or has this, or has that. We get it the next week, then we go put an engine in it, we go test it and try it. It's just the turnaround time at Suzuki, because back then that's really all we were Japanese. There was a Kajiva out there for a little while, but as far as championship contenders, it was just the 3 Japanese brands. And so I can only go off of what I've heard other people say about how much quicker Yamaha and Honda could get things changed and get you something new to try.
Kevin, Adam just mentioned there that you spent your whole Grand Prix career with Suzuki. I've heard you say in the past that you explored the possibility of leaving, I think, at the end of 89 and maybe 91 as well, but you always remained loyal. So from that kind of standpoint, do you respect Fabio Quartararo's decision to sign with Yamaha for 2 further years after this one, considering where they are at the moment?
I think that's a brave man. But yeah, absolutely. Respect him 100% for making that decision. I always felt like at Suzuki, just about the time I leave, they'd get it right again. We had a great bike in 89. It seemed like it, we had good bikes, but never had great bikes. 90, 91, 92, 93, that completely turned around. And I think we had by far the best race bike all season long. Some places we missed on setup and we maybe finished 3rd, or after I got hurt at Donington, 5th. But we were always there. We could always see the front. Sometimes we were the front, but sometimes at least we could still see it. Whereas in previous years, when it wasn't right, it was really bad. But no, I think Suzuki did a great job, and I'm really happy that I stuck with him my whole career.
We were really used to seeing the 34 out of shape, just showing like a spectacular side of the sport, when you were racing. In your opinion, Kevin, how does MotoGP thrill fans now? Because, there's a lot more uniformity to the way the bikes are acting, what they're reacting, how much the riders can express themselves. I mean, if you put yourself in the position of maybe a kid or someone who's new to MotoGP, how does it kind of blow them away, do you think?
I think they've gotten so electronically controlled that, it's hard to see them out of shape much. A lot of times maybe backing them in on the brakes is about all you get to see, but not the big, huge slides and the uncontrollable stuff like we used to have back in the day. And what's even better is to have a new kid on the block like Pedro Acosta out there mixing it up with those guys at the front. And on a bike that his best teammate was barely top 10 this weekend. I think a real tip of the hat to Hervé Poncharal, Pedro Acosta, everybody involved at that team, because Pedro I think he's on his game, and it's just a matter of time before he wins the race.
Yeah, I agree with you there, Kevin. I remember speaking to you at COTA in 2021 when he was still in Moto3. I think that was the weekend where you first got a chance to meet him, and you were impressed by his confidence and the way he carried himself. I remember at that time. I mean, 3 years on, he's just gone from strength to strength, and I mean, he shocked everyone with just how brilliant he's been in the first couple of races. I mean, how do you see him as a kind of rider, and is he a contender for the biggest honors this year, do you think?
He's less than a race win behind, and this is a long season with races on Saturday and on Sunday. So 40-something total races this year? The opportunity to make a mistake, and on Saturday you're only giving away a few points, but on Sunday you're giving away the full chunk of points. So I see everybody having at least one bad weekend this year, and if Pedro just can kind of stay out there, keep his nose clean, and try and get a result every weekend, whether it's P2, P3 up on the podium, whether it's winning a race or maybe top 5 or top 10. You just got to take what you can get each weekend, because, as you said, the bikes are all so close. I mean, if it weren't for the 6 Japanese bikes off the back, I mean, qualifying's less than a second, typically.
And Kevin, obviously you took the 500cc championship by storm in 88, winning your first race as a full-time rider in the class. I mean, I think you're maybe a little bit older than Pedro is now, who's still a teenager, but can you kind of see some similarities there with just how spectacular he's been from the off and how he goes about his business?
I think the main thing is you just can't be intimidated by a Pecco Bagnaia or a Marc Marquez or whoever might be, or the Maverick Viñales. You got to get out there and race them just like they were the guys you were racing in Moto3 and Moto2. don't look at them as their name and their how many world championships. Just approach it as those guys are just numbers. And I'm as capable of beating them as anybody is. And, don't go in all intimidated by who's, you got Pecco on one side and Marc on the other. How many there's 10 or 11 world championships there. You can't think about it like that. As a young kid, this is the coolest thing I've ever done. Racing at this level, racing these bikes, this speed, getting to see so much of the world. Just take every race, one race at a time, and love every minute of it.
A minute ago, you talked about the quantity of races, Kevin. I mean, how do you think you would have survived in MotoGP now with 21 Grand Prix, 21 sprints, social media, promotion? It's not just a career; it's like a real lifestyle now. Yeah,
and especially on a 500, I don't think any of us could have survived 40 plus races. My crash ratio was a little bit higher than most. And injuries probably there a little bit higher. Geez, we have to do twice as many. I mean, I think on the biggest season we ever had was 15 races, and then you do a couple after the season in Japan. So you might have to race 16 or 17 times, but to have to race, like that against those guys at that level on a Saturday and on a Sunday, yeah, it gives you a chance to maybe redeem yourself if you didn't get things right on Saturday. But it's also just as big an opportunity to take two big hits in the points if you make a mistake.
Kevin, just sort of finishing up here, you were part, obviously, of one of the greatest rivalries that MotoGP has ever really seen with yourself and Wayne. In your opinion, is the sport a bit too nice at the moment? Does it need a bit of a kind of clash between the big guys to really grab the attention of the common fan? Because, I mean, what you had going on with Wayne, I think, brought so many people to the racetracks and sort of absorbed so many of the fans of the sport.
I think a little bit of animosity between some riders and, some jabs here and there, something on the starting line. Instead of everybody just sitting there walking off their bikes. I saw Marquez sitting on a cart staring at a garage wall the other day on Sunday before the race, and you could see he was kind of trying to think of the layout of the track and this and that. It's like, if I'd have seen that happening when I was racing, I walked over like, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I'd have bugged him like I used to do with Wayne. I'd go up if he was so Mr. Focus, have his shield just barely cracked, arms crossed, just ready to go racing. I'd walk up and like nudge him, "You ready for this? We're going to have fun. It's going to be a great time, isn't it?" Not every weekend, but when I felt like maybe I had the measure of him, or maybe I needed to try and do something to him to get in his head, so I could possibly race him a little closer than I was going to typically. But yeah, I mean, I think Pedro said it in the press conference the other day. There needs to be more people. There needs to be more interaction amongst the riders, whether it's from a safety standpoint, whether it's from a racing standpoint. But yeah, I mean, anything you can do to help the show makes all the difference in the world.
Was Wayne okay with that, Kevin? Or was it a bit like poking the bear? I mean, did he ever sort of turn around and say, "Look, fuck off, will you?" Or, what?
He never quite got to that. But, sometimes I'd do it. I think it'd make him even madder, and he'd freaking beat me even worse. So, yeah, you had to pick and choose your weekends.
Hey, Kevin, just to finish up, I mean, from what you've seen of MotoGP so far this year, is there a clear favourite? Because looking at the first three races, I mean, there's maybe 4 or 5 guys that can possibly fight for the championship this year. Don't know how you see it.
I talked to somebody going out on the grid the other day, and I'm going to leave his name out of the equation, but I said, "So what's going to happen this weekend?" He says, "Well," he goes, "if the 89 can get his head on straight," he goes, "it's going to be hard to beat, because Maverick's shown us how good he is. He just went down the line. There's got to be a handful of guys that you have to say still are in contention for this championship, especially with the number of races that are out there. Somebody gets some, like Maverick winning both the sprint and the big race. He's got momentum going. Next race, Jerez, probably one of his favorite racetracks if I was guessing. You could see somebody string together 4 or 5 wins. Championship league get really big, get to some tracks you don't like. Everybody slowly slips their way back into the equation. So no clear favorite right now. If I have to have a favorite, I think Bastianini's riding really well, but I really like Acosta's style.
Absolutely, Kevin. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thanks so much for joining us. And can I just compliment you on your background there? That's probably one of the coolest backgrounds I think we've ever had on this show to date. So thanks again for joining us, Kevin.
Thank you. And There's even
Oh.
cooler. There's an
Oh.
even cooler piece of it, and then there's some helmets, and then over there's on the shelf is 23 Grand Prix wins. The other two wouldn't fit on the shelf.
Kevin, can I quickly ask you if you preferred the Lucky Strike or the Pepsi bike, just in terms of looks?
No, that Pepsi bike was beautiful.
Yeah,
I loved it.
I
I
have to
liked it.
agree.
Well, I liked it way more than anything. I liked that bike in '89, the way it ran, the way it handled. Mechanically, it broke on us a couple times. Mechanically, I threw it in the ditch a couple times. But the '93 bike was the second best bike I ever rode. We did good on that and had a great time.
Fantastic, Kevin. Well, thanks again for joining us, and hope to see you at the Grand Prix soon.
Thanks, guys. Good talking to you.
Great to have Kevin on the Paddock Pass podcast, and we're going to have some more special guests over the course of the next few weeks as well. Let's move it back to present day MotoGP as well. And Dave, we're going to talk a little bit about Marc Marquez, because obviously COTA, the expectation was he was going to be the man to beat. He was going to be right at the front all the way through. He had the crash, but what did this tell you about Marc's chances for having a sustained championship challenge this year?
I mean, I thought he was actually a little bit faster than I was expecting. It was interesting listening to his debriefs on like the Friday and to an extent the Saturday as well, because he was having to completely relearn how to ride the track. Previously with the Honda, because the Honda was so agile and so front-endy, all he had to do, he could chase the front end around and flick the bike from side to side through that second section from basically turn 2 all the way down to turn 11. That was where he was making a lot of the time. And the Ducati doesn't turn as easily, especially not with all the aero on. I mean, like they've fixed a lot of the sort of geometry and weight distribution problems that the bike had, but they have added a lot of complication with all the aero that they've put on. So you could sort of like see him. It was interesting watching him through practice work on each particular sort of section, trying to figure out how to go faster and faster. And, it got to the sprint race, it got to especially the Grand Prix on Sunday, and it was clear that he was in a very good position to be able to win that. But he ran into the problem with his brakes. There was a couple of what looked like absolutely wild passes, but afterwards he said, yeah, look, I had no brakes. The brake pads were gone. And so he was sort of like having to dive up the inside of people when it just wasn't possible. And in the end, what happened, it cost him a crash. It caused him to crash because the head of the front wheel of the Ducati shakes and the disc brake shakes, and they knock the brake pads back a little bit. Now, Brembo, a few years ago, I want to say around 18 or 19, came up with a new system, which actually with a spring system, which actually pushes the brake pads back, which helps a lot, but only up to a certain extent. There's only so much it can do. As far as I know, I think everyone on the grid now has this same system. Back in sort of 19 or 20, it was only the factory riders who had them. Everyone has this system now. But it can still happen that when the head of the bike shakes, it goes back sort of too far. And I think this is where the disadvantage of a satellite team is. In a factory team, you have so many people looking at data that you can pick up all of the first signs of these things. You can pick up the warning signs of, look, the head is shaking. That means we're probably going to have problems with the brake pads, and so we'll try to change the setup a little bit. We'll try to change the brake lever a little bit, the brake pressure a little bit, so to prevent it, so that you've got more of a chance of actually grabbing a brake when you press the lever, because there is nothing worse than your front brake not working and you're having to pump it to get it back again. In a satellite team, you've got fewer people to look at all of the massive amount of data that's coming off the bike, and you can overlook little things like that. But I mean, like I thought this was an incredibly positive weekend from Marc, and he's already much further ahead than perhaps some people thought he would, and certainly much further ahead than he's pretending he thought he was going to be.
I agree with Dave. I think it's also a theme of resources. It's not the sort of, I mean, we've seen the Gresini team have a few kind of technical gremlins already during pre-season. But then Marc also was kind of basking in the luxury of being able to see the data from numerous other riders, which wasn't really a sort of facility that he had in the past. So that is one aspect in which he is winning because, Ducati have, I mean, like you said, Dave, they don't have extra staff to provide data, but then he is able to see what people like Martin, Bagnaia, Bastianini, Bezzecchi are doing. I just think, while he's undoubtedly class, he's going to win races and he's going to fight for podiums. Marc Marquez, we've either see him crash and have a very disrupted scorecard or he's dominating. And I just wonder whether he is able to make a championship campaign where he can finish 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, every other week and just like tottle up those points that are needed. Because if he crashes out like he can, a couple of times like he did in America, then there are other riders that are going to increase their points total and it's going to be too tough to win. I mean, when was the last satellite non-factory rider that managed to fight for the world championship? I'm thinking Fabio in 19.
Martin last year, although he was
on a factory bike. Yeah.
Well, then you could probably look at.
Yeah, Martin Fabio wasn't really fighting for the championship in 19 either. He was never really. He was obviously fighting for wins, but not the championship. But yeah, it's a good point that it's not been done for a while.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to go back.
Well, you're probably looking at.
You'd go back to like Gibernau or somewhere like that. But then again, Gibernau was in a satellite team on a factory bike, so you'd really have to go back to maybe the 500 era.
Yeah, I think you're probably looking really though someone like Bastianini on the Gresini bike.
Yeah,
3 years ago he finished 3rd in the championship, but at the end of the day, there's a reason why the factory teams have the resources they have, and even for Pramac with the same spec of bike, there's also that factor where we've seen it time and again where Saturday to Sunday, sprint race to feature race to Grand Prix, we've been able to see where Pecco made a step on Martin, for instance. And that was always quite significant. And a lot of that comes down to just the resources they have. That's just the sheer number of engineers, but also the computing resources and power that they have back in Bologna. And that's going to be factored to or filtered to Pecco before it goes to Jorge Martin, for instance. So that's the big challenge that they face. I think that at the end of the day, for someone like Marc, it's pretty clear that the 23 to 24 bike is a step. And also, you look at what the VR46 riders are doing. You look at Alex Marquez this season. It's been up and down. And that's what we saw at the start of last year as well for the GP23 bikes. So I think it's one of those situations where for Marc, even though you've got a well-sorted package, a good package, it's difficult to win a championship, even for a Marc Marquez, when you're on those independent teams. And I think that that's probably going to be one of the things that for Marc, COTA's a missed opportunity. And now he needs to bounce back because COTA would have been one of those places, Dave, where he would have expected, I can put 25 points on the board. I can have a really strong weekend. And instead, he would have come away disappointed. And whether that's down to mechanical issues or anything else, that disappointment's there. And I think for Marc, it's all well and good that Marc probably should be settling for 4th, 5th, 6th places, get those big chunk of points. Marc had to settle for not winning races for 5 years. He wants to win races, I think, is the big thing for him. And then the championship will take care of itself. At the end of the day, we just had Kevin Schwantz on the podcast. Kevin was like that as well. Win the races, championship will take care of itself. There's going to be mistakes, but that's been Marc's MO all the way through his career. I think it'd be interesting to see what his mindset is now when we get back to Europe.
Just briefly, if things gone slightly differently, he could be walking away from the first 3 rounds with top 5s in every race. He was on course for a solid 4th in Portugal before the clash with Bagnaia. You could argue that wasn't Marc's fault, and COTA, something beyond his control, affected him and caused him to crash. So, one thing though is that he's already in a situation now where he can't really afford any other big slip-ups. If he has one bad weekend in Jerez, then you're almost looking at a situation where he's out of the championship, which is a crazy thing to say so early.
666 points. 666 points. That's a lot of points.
Don't know if you've seen the top guys in MotoGP, Dave, but they're pretty consistent and they're pretty fast. So.
I mean, yeah, but this is like because I can sort of like see this. I'm getting quite excited about the championship as well. You sort of thinking, oh, who's going to be in there? And then I look at how many points there are, and it's 666 fucking points. It's a lot of points. It's an insane amount of points. And like just a couple of things. If you look at last year, there's you can easily come back. You could come back from 4 DNFs in, especially in sprint races or even in main races, just because there are so many points on offer.
Yeah,
it's an appropriate number for you, Dave.
Actually, I have to say, I stole someone's joke on Twitter because they did sort of. I said, look, the 666 points back, and they said, the number of the beast. So I obviously I improved on the joke to make it the number of the bestia, but never mind.
I was actually mostly thinking that when you were mentioning 666 points, you were talking about your position in the Fantasy League. We'll get to that in a wee while. But, Adam, when you look at Mark, you were in COTA at the weekend. What was his demeanour like over the course of the weekend? Because we've seen it over the last few years and then into this year, he's got that bike underneath him to be able to win again. Have you noticed a big shift in Mark?
No, not really, Steve. I mean, in terms of the media debriefs, it's not like he's more frustrated or he's happier or he's relishing, what's going on. If anything, I still think he's finding his way, and that's what he's saying as well. He repeated at least 3 or 4 times this mantra in Texas of saying, "If you offer me a podium now, I'll sign for it." So I think he's being very sort of humble and he's being very realistic with the time he needs to get up to the point where he is winning again in MotoGP. I just don't think as a championship contender, he can afford to let Martin. I mean, Martin's finished on the podium 5 times out of 6 now. Bagnaia is improving as well. There may be a couple other people, Maverick and Aprilia. What are they going to do next? I don't think Marquez can hang around that much longer. I think he'll be really strong in Jerez. This should be another positive track for him. But then it shouldn't be until like we get to Sachsenring again when we're thinking, right, okay, Mark's a shoe-in for a top result here.
Yeah, I mean, I disagree with you, Steve. That Mark is going to be chasing first and second place. My impression. So far I've only spoken to him at the test, but he seems, and just listening to him on the debriefs and sort of watching him in interviews, he seems a lot more calm. He seems a lot more patient. His goal is at the end of the season. His goal isn't at the. He's not, I don't think, approaching it. As Casey Stoner put it, just win the races and the championship will look after itself. He's thinking much more about the first half of this championship is about me learning the bike, understanding the bike, so that I can put on a really strong push in the second half of the championship. He's much, much more patient at the moment. It's the most patient I've seen him in a long time. Also because he's building up his confidence. This is one thing he kept on saying, like, he's building up his confidence. He's coming off basically, 3-4 long, very difficult seasons. He needs to build things up bit by bit. And he's doing that. He's sort of on course. And like I say, there's a lot of points left. Yes, Jorge Martin. I mean, honestly, we don't talk enough about Jorge Martin because he is he's looking just astonishing right now. He's also looking much better than Pecco Bagnaia. He's handling the chatter issue much better, and he identified it much more quickly. He was talking about chatter back in Qatar when no one else was. So this, to me, I think is a sign that he's. How can I put this? He's much more closely entwined with his bike. He understands his bike a lot better than any of the other riders. So yeah, Martin is in really strong form. So, but yeah, there's still a long way, and I think that Mark is going to really start focusing in the second half of the championship.
Yeah, I think understanding your bike is obviously always important, and that's where if you go to KTM.com, you're able to see the full list of bikes that KTM have available based on capacity or the type of bike you're looking for. So whether it's a sporty bike, a naked bike, an adventure bike, or a dirt bike, check out KTM.com. And Dave, it looks like KTM are going to give you a 1290 Super Adventure later in the year as well to ride to a race. So that must be something you're looking forward to.
Yeah, I mean, yes, yeah. I mean, I did come very close to buying a Super Adventure. It's got a little bit too much horsepower for me, but we'll see. We'll soon see about that. I should be. I mean, I've got to go to Austria, so it seems I might as well travel in style.
It's not a bad way to go about it. Let's move on to our last big topic of today's show, and it's Honda. We talked about this a little bit on Sunday, Neil, but can Honda recover by the end of 2024? It looks like any of the light that they're seeing at the end of the tunnel so far has been the train coming at them, but they have to see the resources they're putting in, what they're trying to do with the project. But is there any reason to really have hope for Honda?
Well, it depends what exactly you mean by can Honda recover. I mean, if that means can they finish in the top 10, then yes, I think they can. Can they finish in the top 6? I'm not sure. Can they, finish on the podium by the end of the season? I think it's no, absolutely. I think what we've seen so far this year indicates that that is a bit of a pipe dream currently, because it's bad. It's really bad. It's worse than we probably thought in preseason, because in preseason there is this opinion that Honda are finally taking it seriously again after so many years of disarray, lack of direction, over reliance on Marc, COVID-19 affecting their approach and their efforts. And they've kind of corrected that. They have given the impression that they're taking it seriously, but COTA did show that they may have taken one or two wrong steps in the direction of this 24 bike. They are further away, I think, even than they were at this point last year, because Luca Marini was the sole finisher. In Sunday's race, he was 29 seconds slower than Alex Rins's race-winning time last year. And as Joan was saying, even last year's bike had a strong-ish point. It might not have been as strong as the Ducatis per se, but it was certainly a strong point. And this bike currently has lost all of its agility. It's slow to move from side to side. And then you couple that on the fact that it's got chronic traction issues, which haven't improved from last year. And yeah, you're looking at a very uncompetitive bike. So I think the road back to the top is even longer than even we anticipated, Steve, over preseason.
We had a proper dissection of this on the Sunday show right after the race. So if anyone wants to sort of listen to some more thoughts, then check out that show. But for me, moving forwards, it all hinges on what they can bring to the tests. Both in Jerez, there might already be something in the crate, or Mugello as well. But for me, the biggest marker as well was just the despondency, I think, from Taka Nakagami, who's been sort of the Honda stalwart from the whole crew around, through these present times. And he was just saying he's a complete loss as to what to tell the engineers. He said, last year we could all talk about the lack of rear traction, and Honda obviously done something to readdress the balance, but then they've lost, what was the strength of the RCV and being able to brake and turn extremely quickly. So they're really, really in the mire when it comes to a technical direction. And, Nakagami, who is, explains himself very well, usually on a technical forefront, considering he's speaking in his second language, just said that, it's unacceptable that the motorcycle for 2024 is actually slower than the problem bike of 2023. And the thing is, guys, I just don't think Honda have that reaction speed yet. They might be working 100% quicker than they were in the past, but I doubt whether they can bring anything in the next 4 to 6 weeks that's suddenly going to switch things around. And I do wonder what people like Joan Mir and Nakagami and who they're going to entice to be able to come into the project to try and fix things, because at the moment it really does look like being on the back marker bike. I mean, Luca Marini was sort of just wearing this bizarre smile when he was talking to us in the US, as if to say, guys, I know what I've taken on, but I didn't sort of realize it would be like this. So I find it, maybe they need to overhaul their test program as well. There's still things that HRC need to do.
I think you're spot on, Ad. One thing, I mean, they have really upped their test program. I think they've got something like 22 tests planned. They've got a test in Barcelona before Jerez, and then there's the test after Jerez.
22 tests. Sorry, 22 tests and races, wildcards combined.
Okay, right, yeah. Well, see, that's a lot of stuff going on. So yeah, that I think is really, really important. And like I said on Sunday night, the problem is, they turned a short and high bike into a long and low bike in the hope of gaining the advantages of the long and low bike, which is basically acceleration and drive. But what they've done is they've lost the agility, the advantage they have, and not been able to find the benefits of having a long and low bike. So that's it. And I think I honestly think the Yamaha are in a better position than Honda, because Yamaha started this whole change, this internal change, this engineering change, maybe 18 months to 2 years ago, and it's just starting to feed back in now, and they're a long way back. But now, like Honda are having to go through this. I think they only really started at the end of last year, basically after Marc resigned. That was when things started to change in Honda, and so they've got a lot of catching up to do. And I think Adam made a really good point. Their biggest threat, their biggest danger is who do they get to ride the bike next year? You know, they've got Luca Marini, which will be good because they need the stability, but they need a good rider, someone who can develop the bike to actually push the project forward. That I think is going to be, that's the really, really big question.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that's quite interesting for me is that of the 4 Honda riders, do any of them excite me? And they don't. And I think that's one of the things where for Yamaha are much further along the route, because they've made the technical steps, but they've also got Fabio Quartararo, who we know is one of the top riders on the grid. And Honda doesn't have that. And it's all well and good to have Marini, and he's there for next year, and he's a methodical rider. He gives really good insight when we talk to him, but he's also a guy that's had 2 Grand Prix podiums. You've got Zarco, who knocked on the door for a win for so long, finally got it. You've got Nakagami, who, at the end of the day, if Nakagami's not on the grid, no one really notices. You've got Joan Mir, that's a former world champion, but that 2020 season is looking more and more like an outlier than anything you can think of. It's a little bit like Danny Kent's Moto3 championship. It's so outside of the norm of what else we've seen from Mir, unfortunately, that until he backs that up, it's really difficult to be able to really see where Honda make that step. And at the end of the day, I think, Neil, you're talking in terms of, can we see a podium? Like, all things being equal, no chance. Top 5, not a real chance either. You know, a top 10 is actually a good result for Honda, because when you look at 4 GP23s, 4 GP24s, 2 Yamahas are still going to be ahead of them probably. There's 4 Aprilias out there, the KTMs and the Gas. Like, there's so many more competitive bikes that to see Honda break into that top 10 for me is really difficult. They've been the last 4 bikes on the grid, the last 2 Grand Prix, and it's tough to see how that really changes going forward. But the one thing that is worth keeping an eye on for change is the Alpine Stars Paddock Pass Podcast Fantasy League, because we need to see change. I'm disappointed in the 3 of you.
We need to see change.
And I'll tell you what, Dave's got an excuse because you're just the world's worst person for committing to fantasy. Neil's got an excuse because he picked my team for a week. So, Neil, you're on the back burner on it. Adam, what's your excuse? 567, and you're still ahead of the other 2, but this isn't anything to write home about, boys.
567, Steve. I'd like to think I'm mirroring my football team by being close to the drop, but not that close. And I would argue that Dave is he's the man for fantasy all the time. But it's in terms of setting a team. Yeah, I had a bit of a disaster in COTA. I had to do the Wayne Rainey interview right before Q1, which meant I completely forgot to do my team, and leaving Fabio Quartararo in the lineup probably wasn't the smartest move. It was okay for Portugal, but in the USA, it was not very sensible.
I would say if you're comparing yourself to QPR, 2 points above the drop zone right now, Ad. You got to aim higher than QPR.
Well, I'm QPR, yes.
I would. It's all very well you praising Adam, but I would point out I'm only 12 places behind him, so it's not that far behind him. And anyway, I was robbed because I had Mark in my fantasy team, and he was betrayed by his brake pads. Otherwise, I think I would have been the one with a smug smile on my face here.
Did you boost him though, Dave?
I did not boost him. No. I wasn't that confident. But I did have. I had Marquez, Bastianini, and Acosta in the team, which would have put me on for a fantastic haul on Sunday. But then disaster struck.
Neil, what about your team? Obviously, you missed out in the first round of the year, but now you're finding your stride. You're 864th out of 889 people. So solid work there, big man.
Yeah, it's pretty brutal. It's a long way back to the top. But well, I don't really know what to say, Steve, to be honest. Yeah, similar situation to Dave. Mark was in my team, and and Pecco as well. So I've got to completely redress the balance and really have a hard look at it before Jerez. So yeah, let's chat in 2 weeks' time.
I should say Mark was on my team as well, and I'm 108th, so we can't use the Mark as excuse, lads. Just looking at the table right now, Dane's helmet is leading the way, but they've used 2 of their boosts already. So if you look down to number 6 on our Paddock Pass podcast Fantasy League is Top Rack's Break Guy, and he's the first that hasn't used a boost, and he's in the top 6. So that's really impressive. But we'll obviously be keeping an eye on the fantasy all the way through the course of this season. Also worth keeping an eye on for us is our feedback channels. So Twitter, Instagram, Patreon, email, whatever you want to send to us, we'll take a look at it. We got a couple of questions in as well, and Adam, I'll come to you straight off the bat on this one. Pedro Acosta, is it worth keeping him at Gas, or would KTM be the most foolish manufacturer in the world by not putting him on their factory bike?
Big questions as to what happens with the team next year. I mean, the Pira Mobility Group has 3 brands. Do they go back to being KTM? Do they become MV Agusta? Do they stay Gas? Do they change into Husqvarna's? That's also, I think, a very valid question when it comes to that particular setup. The positive thing is that Acosta seems to be thriving in that environment, and his link with Paul Chirathon and the rest of the guys around him should not be underestimated or understated. So that's one thing where you think, well, okay, he seems to be doing great where he is. Let's just keep things as they are. Let's keep Miller in place, perhaps on a smaller contract or whatever, or just like a 1-year deal. It's hard to say, Steve. I mean, he is pretty much the golden child, as we know, inside KTM. So a team of him and Brad Binder would be, extra formidable based on current results. And, Paul Chirathon, of course, was in the factory team. So it would be fairly easy to slide him across and just reset stuff. So but it's a good question. I mean, it's not like taking Acosta out of that particular thing would be positive or negative either way. Muted, Dave.
You're muted, Dave.
You leave him in for the rest of the season. I mean, of course you leave him in for the rest of the season. There's no reason to move him across this year. He's happy where he is. There's no pressure. He can just get on with it. But the second thing you do is you find the largest pile of money you can find inside of the Pira Mobility Group headquarters, and then you hand it to Pedro Acosta, and you sign him up for about 14 years, and you put him in the factory team for next year. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, I'd never really understand why people think that he'd move across mid-season, because for the Tech 3 team, they've built their budget around having a rider on the bike, and Pedro gives them and their sponsors the chance to be able to have those strong results. And I think for Jack Miller, I don't really see how you keep Jack on the factory bike next year, and then it becomes interesting what happens for Jack. And that's one of the questions that's being asked in the Superbike paddock at the minute. Obviously, I'm here in Aston this weekend, and a lot of people are wondering now, especially after COTA and what we saw from Pedro, what that means for Jack and whether he could potentially be on the market for here. So I think for me, if KTM don't have Pedro on the factory bike next year, I really couldn't understand it. But it's just been super from him for the first 3 rounds this season. Just to ask another question as well, the front tyre temperatures and pressures. We obviously had a change in the regulations for this year that gave the teams a little bit of an easier time, Dave, compared to what we had last year for front tyre pressures. But what has the impact of that been? Because the question we had in was basically we haven't heard anything about tyre pressures so far this season.
I mean, there's been a few things. First of all, Michelin have bought a slightly harder front compound with the same grip as the softer compound. That makes a difference. But the biggest difference is, well, first of all, the penalty is there. And secondly, the teams have got a lot more they've got a lot more experience. They've got a lot more data. They understand it a lot better. Also, we haven't been to, I think we're going to see a lot more of it at Jerez. Jerez is a track, especially if it gets really hot like it can do. It's going to be a place where track temperatures and front tire temperatures is going to be a very, very big thing. But honestly, the biggest thing is just basically that there is jeopardy now. There wasn't jeopardy last year. Basically, the teams were using the warning, which they had, as a wild card. They were just using it as a gamble. So they were rolling the dice on lower temperatures, and the riders are better at it. The teams are better at it, and they know that the penalty will count.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big things for it. Just on next week's show, Adam, we've got a very special guest again, and another bit of American racing royalty.
Yes, right, Steve. As I mentioned, we sat down with Wayne Rainey in the Circuit of the Americas, so that will be on next week's show. And just sealing off I think was it Dave or Neil said earlier, one of the most fierce and famous rivalries in the Premier class.
Yeah, it's going to be great to have Wayne on the show next week. And we've also got a World Superbike wrap-up from Assen as well coming up. And it's been a really exciting start to the season for us in World Superbikes. So we'll see what Assen brings as well. And obviously, the Cathedral of Speed, Ad, you have to look forward to it. It's almost as much as I looked forward to the rodeo of horsepower, the horsepower rodeo, whatever they were calling in Texas. That's how I feel about COTA is the same as you in the Cathedral of Speed.
Yeah, just fucking enjoy it, Steve. Go and pray.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm praying for dry weather because it's been raining since I got here. So hopefully over the course of the weekend, we're able to get some dry running and plenty of good racing. Check out patreon.com/Paddock Pass Podcast for all of our additional content as well. We've got lots of interviews, features up there. From the Superbike side, we've got Gordon Ritchie Remembers. So it's 25 years in the World SBK Paddock for Gordo, and he's got lots of stories from that time. So we've been posting quite a few of them up on Patreon. So check out patreon.com/Paddock Pass Podcast. As ever, a big thank you to KTM, Renthal Street, and to Fly Racing for supporting the Paddock Pass Podcast. We'll be back next week with Wayne Rainey on the podcast.